So Peter is from New York, and the question is, what's a guy from the Bronx, I think he said, doing in New York? My answer was they either won't let him out of China or they won't let him back into the U.S., one or the other. But he's been there for 31 years, basically. So, and he runs an investment banking firm called China First Capital. And the words China First have meaning because he's really focused on helping raise capital for either Chinese companies or out of country companies that want to do business and build things in China. He's in Shenzhen and has quite a career. He's run a venture capital fund. He's been a corporate CEO. He's a Cambridge University graduate, master's degree from England, and is a consistent and excellent contributor to all of the great media that you're all familiar with, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Chinese media as well. And his forte is commenting on insights and analyses of what's going on in China. And it's under that aegis that I've asked him to come and speak with our class. This is the third time that he will have done it, and he enjoys it. He was here in person last year. His travels didn't take him to the U.S. exactly this time around, but he's been good enough to join us on Blue Jeans. So here comes the rest of our class. I knew if I talked long enough that they would show up eventually. So without further ado, let me introduce and please welcome Peter Fuhrman. Let me say one other thing. We will have microphones, and as we go along, you will have the opportunity to ask questions and make this a two-way kind of discussion. Okay? Peter, go ahead.
Well, Chinese, maybe some of you will know, there's a custom in China when you receive applause, you applaud back. And I'm going to do that because I want to thank all of you for coming out on a Monday evening and on a federal holiday Monday evening. That's first priority, but an even larger one is I want to applaud David for now many years of friendship and support and giving me this wonderful and much sought after opportunity today to share some views about this year. We're going to talk more about the perilous state of U.S.-China relations. And I'm hoping that we'll get through my fixed presentation, and I hope it elaborates on some of what you've been reading and maybe provide some context. Through that, I'm very much aware of the fact that you gather with David in the lead to study the field that occupies much of my time, which is private equity. So I won't be today discussing private equity as a primary factor in why U.S.-China relations have become so strained and what it means, because of course private equity is more a passive passenger on this train rather than leading in the direction that U.S.-China relations are going. But I'm mindful that that's an important part of all of your scholastic, personal, and professional interests. So I will continue to refer to the implications to private equity and welcome your questions. A couple of other things just by way of prologue. I'm now not wearing headphones, as you notice. That means I just didn't want to appear quite as frightening to you when we initiated the class today, but I'm going to go ahead and in a second put the headphones on because it'll let me hear you better as well as let you hear me better. So here goes. Okay, so now I look like I want to give a couple of notes of prologue and additions to what David was kind enough to mention about my background. Though I have had a hands-on first-person experience back, and if you listen to the result, of almost 40 years. I came to China in 1980. Intake of American postgraduates
So I had a very early taste. Graduate
Peter,
student.
Peter,
Yep.
excuse me. Uh,
Yep.
Try taking your earphones off because you're breaking up or only getting every second word.
I will go ahead and speak without the earphones. So I was saying, I'm not
Yeah.
sure how much of you you got the first time through then, David. So my experience with China does go back a great long while. And as I was saying, I kind of am stopped dead in my own tracks when I think about it. I first came to China in 1981 as the among the first postgraduate American postgraduate students admitted for study in Chinese universities. At that time, I was a student in Nanjing University, which is about 1,000 miles north of where I join you from today in the city of Shenzhen. So I have not been here continuously since 1981, but China has been an interest, an abiding, guiding interest and fascination of mine since I was a little boy. You could say I got bitten by the China bug, and I don't know how or why. I often wonder myself at a very early age. The only context I can share with you is that my maternal grandfather, my mother's father, had investments and factory operations in Shanghai before the Chinese Revolution. He's an American businessman. Mainly his business was in the U.S. East Coast. But even then, in the 1930s and 40s, he had diversified his business to enter the Chinese market and manufacture there. So though he lost those assets and those investments during the Chinese Revolution, growing up with him, I was very profoundly impacted and influenced in a positive way by his recollections of the time he spent in China, and also by the beauty, the transcendent beauty of the Chinese antique art collection he'd assembled. And I was lucky enough to then inherit that. And some of it sits behind me in my office here in Shenzhen. I've had this very long association, deep association with China, and have seen it make this remarkable transformation since 1981 into the phenomenally successful society and economy we now know China to be. So that's by way of backdrop, a few quick additions and broadening of David's introduction. We're actually now as a firm, we're much more involved in a field that I'm happy to share with you and maybe take questions about. I would explain what we do. It's not a term that's all that familiar in American financial English, as what we focus on is something called merchant banking. It's much more commonly found in the UK than in the US, but tends to be just an optimal business model for China. And what that means quite simply is we're kind of a marriage of an investment bank with a principal investment company. So we do both. We do investing and we do advising for our companies and partners. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. I also want to, as a way of setting the scene today, at least take note of the fact that every once in a while, through a wonderful, what we would call a harmony of the spheres, the Chinese lunar calendar and the US federal vacation calendar mutually coincide and conspire to celebrate a holiday on the same day. So obviously you all know, sitting there in Ann Arbor, that today is Washington's birthday, President's Day. Here in China this morning in Shenzhen, Tuesday morning, Tuesday is a very important holiday in China. It's called Yuan Xiaojie in Chinese, or in English, it's sometimes translated as Lantern Festival. It's officially the final day of the Chinese New Year celebration. So it's exactly 2 weeks ago today that Chinese New Year began. And Chinese send the New Year holiday out with a bang by designing, displaying, and floating up in the sky beautiful paper lanterns. So I get to look forward to that this evening when I come home. A little bit more than by way of background, that as David said, I'm based here in the city of Shenzhen. To give you some sense about that, I think some of you may know it's considered the high-tech Silicon Valley of China. And when I first set foot in this city back in 1981, when I was coming into China for the first time, it was a little fishing village with a population about 1/3 the population of Ann Arbor today. So back then, Shenzhen had about 30,000 people. Ann Arbor today has about 120,000, 115,000, so less than a third. Shenzhen was when I first arrived here. Today, what I'm looking out on from my office is a city of about 22 million people. And though I'm sure all of you have read numbers coming from China that are driven by them having such a large population, there are many cities now in China that number among, obviously, the biggest in the world. So what sets Shenzhen a little bit apart, as well as its status as the private sector capital of China, the high-tech capital of China, what also sets it apart, even at a time of phenomenal urban expansion and growth, right, which has seen the population of cities you're very familiar with, like Beijing and Shanghai, also double and triple over the last 25 years. Obviously, Shenzhen is unprecedented in global urban history, to have gone from such a small town to such an enormous city in such a relatively short period of time. And, if we have time later, I can talk a little bit more about why we chose to be located here, but I think I kind of tipped it off by suggesting this is the private sector and the high-tech capital of China, as well as being home to one of two of China's stock markets. China has a stock market in Shanghai and a stock market in Shenzhen. They're of about equal size, and the simple way to understand those two different stock markets, the one in Shanghai is overly represented by what are called Chinese SOEs, by Chinese state-owned companies, while the Shenzhen stock market is mainly home to China's private sector, entrepreneur-founded and led companies. So Shenzhen's importance within China, both as a capital market center and as a driver of the economy, is reflected by the fact that during these many years that I've had an association with China, it's gone from being an economy that was 100% state-owned. So there was once upon a time in China only state-owned enterprises, only SOEs, to where today almost all new net job creation, new business GDP growth, as well as most of the highest and most profitable companies in China belong to the private sector. By some estimates now, the private sector in China is contributing between 55 and 60% of China's overall economy. So remember, from zero, 20 years ago, zero private sector, zero legal private companies, to now where it is the overwhelmingly dominant and most important part of China's economy. So then a little bit more about my company to give some more additional context to what we'll be talking about is, again, as I said, we operate with one foot in two camps, much more actively with our customers and clients, trying to determine, identify, and then act on what we believe to be significantly interesting long-term investment opportunities in China. We're, as far as I know, one of the very few companies, financial firms in China that do this kind of work. We have pure play PE firms, we have pure play investment banks, and as I say, we kind of sit in the middle. We as a company try to be very active, very proactive in trying to look for, scout for, identify, research, and define good areas of investment rather than waiting passively for entrepreneurs to come to us with their ideas. Nothing wrong with that. But China, at this moment in its history, there are many, many of what I sometimes refer to as market failures, by which I mean that there are very large market opportunities here in China's domestic market, right? 1.4 billion people, increasingly affluent, increasingly interested to spend their money shopping and enjoying life. So there are many opportunities in the China consumer and technology sectors that we think are best served by this merchant banking model, where together very often with some of the largest companies in China, as well as some of the largest companies globally, principally in two different industries, what we would call consumer spending and branding companies, as well as high technology companies, we forge with them partnerships to develop businesses specifically targeting China. So that's what we do. Again, I'm very happy to be back in the class and hope I'll be back again in Ann Arbor soon. It's a beautiful place and enjoyed very much my last visit. So today what we're going to talk about is, as you see from the first screen here, is what exactly is happening between China and the US? Why did it all seem to have arisen so suddenly? What does this forecast for the future of business investment in both countries and globally? Those are very important questions to ask, and none of us, as you could probably imagine, can really foretell how things will evolve from here. I think, as you know from reading the newspaper, we're now less than 2 weeks away from the deadline that was agreed the last time the presidents of China and the US met in Argentina in early December to try to forge some kind of agreement to prevent the US from triggering a next round of what could be quite economically challenging tariffs on Chinese exports to the US. That would be what we would call a full-blown trade war. So we gather today really on the cusp of what would be an unprecedented development in world economic history, as well as the history of the relationship between China and the US. I think it would be accurate to say that US and Chinese relations have not been this strained now for over 50 years. China and the US reached a kind of entente, a kind of friendship in the early 1970s. Maybe some of you are aware this transformational trip that then President Richard Nixon made to China in 1972, where he met Mao Zedong. So already, obviously, the pieces were being laid for that visit several years before. So really, by about 1970 till today, China and the US, you could say, while each approaching the relationship from a very different perspective and based on a very different political and social structure, China and the US have been very close economic and financial partners, as well as strategic partners, really since 1970-71. And for a lot of us watching over those years, it's been an unbroken record of great success, because when China and the US first began this very early state of partnership that then bloomed into a scale that no one could have imagined, China was at that point in the early 1970s a very poor country. And the US decided, both politically and then obviously driven by businesses in the US, that helping China to regain a more proper role in the world economy, because remember, 500 years ago, during the last height of Chinese imperial power during the Ming Dynasty, China had the largest GDP in the world. So what China really is doing now, and which the US, you could see, both saw 50 years ago and helped play nursemaid to, was China regaining a sense of economic and social importance in the world that it had lost 500 years ago. And that has, again, paid enormous dividends for both societies, and we'll talk about that more this evening. But today, we're gathered here at this very unforeseen moment in the history of the two countries, where we'll try to decompile what China and the US now are confronting as economies and societies. What does this mean for finance, for investment? How will it alter world economics and commerce? And I hope through that we'll gain some additional perspective, both on how to be smart business people integrating China into the future plans we may have, as well as what it means for the two societies as a whole. The title in my speech today may be a word that not many of you are familiar with. It's pronounced Chimerica, Chimerica. That term, you could probably look at it and understand its meaning. It was first kind of gained popularity in English about 12 years ago. And what the word was meant to explain, and it's remarkable to think how far we've come from then, is that it seemed to a lot of very wise people that China and America were increasingly merging as two economies. Their trade was exploding, mutual investment was growing very quickly, there was a great deal of activity on a political level where both China and the US were coordinating their policies very closely in order to continue to steer the world towards a greater sense of global prosperity and stability. So in a very short period of time, we moved from a world in which most investors, political commentators, and experts were seeing China and the US as inevitably growing more intertwined, have now reached a point where the relationship has not been as confrontational, with as much mutual acrimony as we have today for, as I say, at least 50 years. So we're all now looking at a world in which what was seen to be the inevitable further and deeper integration between China and the US is certainly now in doubt. The US and China once viewed each other as essential partners and custodians of global prosperity. And today, the trade between the two countries, even today, during this challenging period, is over 10 times larger, the trade between the US and China, than it was 2 decades ago. So now we're in another state where it appears that the two countries are contemplating what's now being called not Chimerica, but a decoupling, where the two economies may be now moving further and further apart. We don't yet know how completely this decoupling process will be. We don't know its outcome. But we do know that wherever US and China relations go from here, it will have profound impact, not just on those two societies, but the world economy generally. China is a very different country than it was 20 years ago or even 10 years ago when the concept of Chimerica first came into fashion. Along with being a much richer and more satisfied country, it's also become a more assertive country as the world's second largest economy, and much more self-reliant, much less reliant on exports, not only generally, but also exports to the US. That's because, again, as China has developed its own internal domestic market of 1.4 billion consumers, are becoming more and more the source for much of China's economic forward progress, satisfying the needs not of global customers as much as China's own home market. So from us as business people in China, and I do want to reinforce this, investing in and with China still makes as much sense as it ever did, but where and how to invest successfully in China is most likely going to be changing significantly. Now, I hope you'll keep your eye now on the red bar that's moving up along the left, where you'll see China. See, it began in 1981 when I first got here, down at the bottom, and you'll see now, as China, year by year, you'll see the years on the right, how it has been climbing up the global league table as the world's largest economy. When I arrived in 1981, China's economy had a total size of about $300 billion. That time, that put it at basically the same level as the economy of Chad, one of the poorest countries in Africa, and it was about 1/3 the size of Guatemala, which is generally considered one of the more backward countries in the Latin American continent. As of today, Chad's economy during those 40 years is 3 times larger than it was. Guatemala did a bit better than that. It's grown by about 4 times. What about China? I think, as you just saw, as it made this remarkable ascent up that chart that I'm showing, the Chinese economy is now almost 50 times larger than it was in 1980. Now, we saw, of course, there's a lot of movement by China moving up to become a much more important global economic power. But if you noticed, if you were keeping track of it, there hasn't been a lot of change elsewhere in the top of the world's leading economies. In other words, China really is an outlier. Other than China, the world today is still dominated economically by what were once called the G8 countries. Those are US and its allies. But China has uniquely, among this group of privileged developed countries, really pushed its way into the world's economic elite. And not it is only now second to the U.S. in size, but even looking at its relations with all those other very large, what we call Western economies, Japan, Germany, France, UK, Italy, for almost all of them, China is their largest outside trading partner, with the exception for the EU countries trading with one another. So what also makes China unique is not only does it have these very extensive economic and trade relations with all the major countries in the world, unlike all those other nations, China is not allied with any of those other nations you see on the screen. That again makes China unique. China is deeply important economically, it's deeply integrated, but at the same time, China stands alone from these economies, not part of any formal alliance, either economic or political or military. Another thing to notice, just by way of context, of course, to see just how China, what it's achieved over the last 40 years, really is unparalleled in world economic history. You probably noticed there about halfway down the table, you'll see Brazil. Now, David and I have been around long enough to recall that 30, 40, even 50 years ago, most intelligent economic commentators, as well as many investors and businessmen in the US, their certain prediction of the world economic future that we now call the year 2019 was that Brazil would become an economic superpower. Had very large population, very large land mass, close to the US. It seemed to have everything going for it. So there was an enormous amount of US investment into Brazil in the 1970s and 80s, particularly based on what was seen to be the near certain presumption that Brazil would become a very important economic superpower, probably much like that of China today. But if you remember back, and I won't replay the animation, what you'll see in the case of Brazil is it hasn't moved. Its relative position is about where we started 40 years ago. And that's because Brazil, unlike China, has been hobbled by almost continuous economic and financial mismanagement, sometimes really on a colossal scale, where China, pretty much without exception since 1978, has enjoyed remarkable political and economic stability, and a government and a population dedicated and pointing themselves towards trying to achieve a better economic outcome. So China's per capita GDP during the time of the chart in front of you grew from about $195 per person in China to where today it's about 10,000 US dollars. In other words, Chinese now, if you do the sums, they are 50 times richer personally, individually, than they were in 1980. At that same year, 1980, when this particular animation began, China's GDP was then about 12,000 US dollars. So at that point, it was just enormously larger than China's. So from $195 to 12,000. But if the US had grown, if the US economy had grown, it's almost unfathomable. But if it had grown at the same speed as China since 1980, per capita GDP in the US today, instead of being $55,000, which is not bad at all, if it had grown at the same rate as China, per capita income, individual per capita income now in China would be in the US would be at over 6 million US dollars. So that really does give some sense about how remarkable the explosion of personal wealth and economic opportunity has been in China over these last 40 years. No one could have foreseen it, and what we'll be talking about in terms of now a world in which the US and China are increasingly at odds with one another, that was partly driven by no one could have foreseen that China would grow this fast for this long and achieve such great economic success. So where we are today is, if you look on the chart on the left, a lot of things in China are driven by what we call the law of big numbers, which means when you have a population of 1.4 billion, so that's about 4 times larger than the US population, a lot of numbers get to be very large just because you have so many heads that are engaged when you're talking about what goes on here in China. So China, with a population of 1.4 billion, the economy is still growing and individuals are still getting wealthier at a rate of about 6% a year. Now that's lower than it was a couple years ago, but still obviously is tracking at a rate of economic growth that still outpaces every other developed country by enormous margins, now including the US. Right? The only place in the world now that is growing with the same speed as China is India, and only a large economy, but China is today about 5 times richer than India. So China, from a very large economic base, is still growing quite quickly. So what's going to be the inevitable outcome of that? If you look on the left, by somewhere between 2025, so 5-6 years from now, certainly within the next decade, China will become the world's largest economy. So that if I'm lucky enough with David's invitation to be back here at that time, that animation I just showed you will show that red bar of China actually then crawling up above the US and overtaking the US to become the world's largest economy. That's in what we call nominal terms. So that's just the pure size of the economy, not adjusted for what's called purchasing power. But that's going to be a pretty remarkable world that we're now all on the threshold of participating in, which will be quite literally China as number one. So I think barring any unforeseen economic catastrophe of a scale that is really generally, I think, incomprehensible, this is an absolute certainty that China will become the world's largest economy in a matter of years. Though keep in mind, as the chart on the right tries to show, this is a remarkable achievement. If you look at the line on the chart on the right, the red line, what that's showing is that China's per capita GDP as a percentage of the US. So that's measuring just in straight economic terms, not based on who owns how many cars and has how many square feet of living space, just measures the size of the economy divided by the number of people. On that strict financial metric, the US still remains about 4.5 to 5 times richer per capita than China. So there still is an enormous difference between the overall level of economic development in the US and China. But I think as that chart shows you as well on the right, China has made really impressive gains, because not that long ago, at least for some of us, US was quite literally 50 times richer per capita in China. So China will continue, those lines on the right will continue to rise. China will close the gap almost certainly between the US and itself in per capita income. And I think it would be reasonable to predict that China will certainly, in your professional lifetimes, also close the gap economically that still exists with the 3 other of what we call the greater China economies. Those are Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. The 3 of those are obviously all much smaller in population. Hong Kong and Singapore each have populations of between 6 and 7 million. Taiwan is larger, about 20 million, so you can't compare those economies to the size of China. They still remain about 3 times richer than the PRC, but that gap is closing most quickly because those economies, Hong Kong and Singapore and Taiwan, are not growing as quickly as China. So what I think all of you can imagine is at least that the greater China economies, these 4 large economies, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the PRC, will increasingly converge. And that's good news for everyone here in Asia, that those economies are all becoming step by step together more deeply integrated and together much more successful and affluent. What I want to give you now is at least some visual prompt to understand. There's a lot of information to take in, between the US and China. And what it's mainly measuring, and by the way, if any of you want this deck to study at greater detail at any time, then I think I'll be able to share it either directly through David, or you'll see at the end of my presentation my email, and I welcome you to email me and I can send you a copy of it. So what you see here is across what are really just a great variety of the most important metrics, that there are still some areas of large difference between the US and China. But there are a few surprising similarities. Let's start with one that isn't that widely known, which is by an accident of geography. The landmass of China and the US are remarkably similar in size. Hard to imagine, but true. Okay, though the populations, of course, as we discussed, are still wildly divergent, and the US economy is still overall a lot larger. There still remain very large differences up and down the line between the US and the Chinese economy, but some other areas of similarity that may come as something of a surprise is in an area like healthcare. Believe it or not, China today per capita, meaning based on the size of the US and the Chinese economy, actually has more hospital beds per person, per 1,000 people, than the US, and has almost as many doctors. The result of that, and that's been the outcome of a great deal of investment and increase in the number of both hospitals and medical schools training up doctors, is one of the happy results over these last 40 years from when I first set foot in China, is China's overall health levels, particularly as measured by life expectancy, which is a wonderful positive sign of just how far China has come as a country. When I first came to China, China's life expectancy was about 55 years. At that time, the US was approaching 75. US hasn't moved very much over that time. We're still about 75 years average life expectancy. China, on the other hand, thanks to this remarkable improvement and deep penetration even into the smallest rural areas of China, what we would consider quality Western healthcare, which is always in China accessorized and assisted by traditional Chinese medicine. The result is now, as of today, Chinese and American life expectancy is almost identical. Okay, though the results, the difference here that's most notable is that the US, in order to achieve that outcome, is spending 4 times more of its national wealth on healthcare than China does. In other areas like foreign direct investment, in other words, where the world's investment community, private equity, institutional investors, portfolio investors corporate investors choose to place their money, China and the US really tend to be the number 1 and number 2 countries year after year after year. And they're also very similar in inbound, what's called foreign investment. They're very similar in terms of equal importance in the US and the Chinese economy. Overall exports, overall imports by China and the US, surprisingly not that far apart. What you're seeing on the right-hand side of the chart is something that's much more meaningful for people like me who are fortunate enough to call China home, which is it's showing in those circles differences in relative pricing. In other words, how much do things cost in the US versus in the case of this particular chart, how much they cost in New York, my hometown. So surprisingly, though salaries, not just per capita income in the US is about 4.5 times larger, average salaries are still about 4 to 5 times larger in the US than in China. So despite that, despite wages being much higher in China, it may be surprising to everyone except the people in the room here who've spent time in China or themselves PRC citizens. Prices here for many things in China are really similar to prices in the US, if not higher in many cases. One consistent great bargain here in China, which I'm particularly grateful for because I was able to take advantage of it this morning here on Tuesday in China, is of course the cost of public transit. It remains a really strikingly good deal in China. So I come to work every day in Shenzhen by taking the metro, by taking the subway system here. I go 15 stations. It's a brand new metro line, fully air conditioned, really beautiful, safe, smooth, quiet. And my ticket every day costs me 4.75 renminbi, or about 70 cents. When I come to my office on the weekends, which I generally do, I enjoy working on Saturday. It's much quieter here. I tend to take the bus from where I live, which is next to the water. Shenzhen is a city that's on the water. I take a bus, a public bus to my office. It's about 35 minutes. The bus ticket costs the equivalent of about 25 cents. So on many areas on that chart on the right, you'll see that Chinese are paying the same or higher prices than we do for many items in the U.S., but public transport remains a great deal. By the way, that's despite the fact that cars themselves and gasoline prices in China are both higher than they are in the U.S., but public transport remains heavily subsidized, and so quite a good way to get around. The structure of the population, which is the figures encapsulated on the top right, are broadly similar, okay, which means the diversification of the population of China and the U.S. by age is broadly, as you can see, pretty consistent based on age groups, but that's going to change dramatically in the next 2 decades. By the year 2040, over 25% of Chinese, compared with less than 10% today. 25% of the population of China will be over the age of 65. China will be, by that time in its history, one of the oldest countries in the world based on average age. That's because life expectancy has grown, as I've talked about. Chinese are healthier and living longer. And the other factor that's been unique in the structure of China's demography has, of course, been, as I'm sure all of you in the room are aware of, that until recently there were strict policies in place in China to prevent population growth. Okay? And those policies achieved their primary goal. In other words, when they began to be implemented, again, about the same time I first arrived in China in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Chinese government made a quick calculation and understood if it didn't do something to slow the birth rate, China, even by that point in its history, was a little bit under 1.4 billion, but already had a very large population. China understood it needed to arrest the rapid climb in its population. China was, its population, growing as fast until 1980 as India's is today. And how fast is India's population growing? Well, over that same period between now and 2040, when China becomes a country made up of an overwhelmingly large number of older retired folks, by then, by far, India will be the largest country by population in the world, because they still continue to have much larger families. A quick note about that. Chinese government, after achieving their stated goal, which was to arrest or even turn back the rapid growth in its population, to give you some sense, when the Chinese Revolution took place in 1949, China had a population of about 400 million. So you can just kind of visualize between 1949 and 1979, the population tripled. They stopped that in its tracks, but then gradually became aware over the last few years that where China was growing as a society was not a very stable place for any kind of country, particularly one that was trying to achieve consistent high performance in terms of overall economic growth and financial success. Why is that? Because obviously, I think everyone can understand, the more your population ages, the more retired people there are in a country, the fewer there are contributing to economic growth and to GDP. So the Chinese government became aware that as their population was getting older, they could look out into the future and see, well, there were going to be fewer and fewer Chinese in the workforce every year. Fewer and fewer workers, as we've seen in Japan over the last 20 years, where something very similar has already taken place. when the population begins to fall every year, first the working population, because more and more people are getting older and retire, and then the overall population starts to shrink, as it's doing now in Japan, there's virtually no GDP growth per year, year after year. Now, per capita GDP does grow because the population is shrinking. So even if the economy doesn't grow, fewer people means everyone is, believe it or not, and that's been the case in Japan over the last 20 years, they are individually, at least statistically, a little bit richer. So China could see what was happening in neighboring Japan and understood that that wasn't the kind of future they foresaw for their country, because bringing an end because of a population that was skewing ever more towards retirees instead of active workers was not going to allow the Chinese economy to grow in the way that the Chinese government certainly hopes and plans that it should. So rather suddenly, the Chinese now 2 years ago relaxed and eliminated the controls on all Chinese having a second child. So formally, for the last 2 years, Chinese for the first time in 45 years have been able to have a second child not only without any difficulty, in fact now with government encouragement. But perhaps foreseen by some, but I think now increasingly seen as a surprise by many in the leadership in China, though they turned the light on giving birth to children from red to green 2 years ago, Chinese themselves are rather predictably making individual decisions to in fact have fewer and fewer children. And the reason for the decline in the Japanese population, the reason for the fall in the population in countries in Europe, as well as elsewhere in developed Asia, so Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, they all have declining populations, net of migration, because people have fewer kids, because people begin to think of children as an expense, not an asset. And we just finished in 2018 something that very few people could have expected, which is though now the society is encouraging and embracing the birth of the building of larger families. Last year, 2018, China had the fewest new children born since 1961. Okay, so the population here in China, though the Chinese government themselves is trying to do what it can now to reinvigorate it, Chinese individually are not, we could say, getting the message. So it does seem that this track that China is on, where it becomes a much older society with fewer and fewer active workers, is, at least for now, almost inevitable. So what does that mean? And it actually plays a little bit into where the U.S. is trying to steer its relationship with China. And let me explain why that is. Obviously, people in the U.S., people who make decisions about the direction of China policy, China economic, strategic, military, social policies, they are equally aware of where China is heading demographically, which is to say that it's going to become a very old country based on average age by about 20 years from now. So what that means for the U.S. is they really don't need to concern themselves, it seems, with a China that will continue to grow as remarkably quickly in the future, meaning by the middle of this century and beyond, as it has for the preceding 40 years. And the reason is, as I say, because not only the number of older people is going to increase dramatically in China, but the population overall. Now, no one is sure. Maybe we will yet have another baby boom here in China. Seems unlikely, but it's possible. But absent that, if we continue on the path where we are now, China's overall population between now and the end of this century, where I think many of you in the room here today will be probably around to see this all come to pass, China's population is at least projected to go from 1.4 billion to somewhere between 7 and 800 million people. That's still a large country, but no country, obviously, in human history will have seen such a dramatic decrease in overall population size over what's been a really comparatively very short period of time. In other words, in less than 80 years. And that, again, does look like it now seems to be on a path that's going to be very difficult to reorient away from. So what that means for the U.S., which thanks to both slightly higher rates of childbirth in the U.S. than at least in European countries, as well as the fact, I think, as we all know, we benefit from lots of emigration every year, lots of new immigration. The U.S. population continues to grow and likely will through this same period when China's economy is and population is beginning to shrink rather dramatically. So the piece of this particular chart that will change the most over your professional lives is the construct of the Chinese population, that it will grow smaller in overall size and overall much, much older. So as I mentioned, over the last 20 years, trade between the U.S. and China has grown by over tenfold. You'll see that there in the chart on the right. When I first came to China in 1980, the trade between the two countries was minimal. It was less than $20 billion in total. As of 2018, we don't have the final numbers, but if we added up total U.S. exports to China and Chinese exports to the U.S., the total trade between the two countries is now well above $600 billion. So exactly about 12 times higher than it was in 1995. Now, what you'll also see on the trade, on the chart on the left, is not only that trade between China and the U.S. has grown overall by enormous amounts, and that's, I think, as everyone knows, because of two factors, because of U.S. companies doing more to diversify their manufacturing and importing more products from China. That's a big part of this. So when you see statistics for Chinese exports to the U.S., keep in mind, based on most conservative accounting, somewhere between 40 and 50% of all those exports are U.S. companies like Apple manufacturing in China and then distributing back into the U.S. It doesn't mean that all these exports from China are from Chinese companies themselves. So the U.S. business community, I think, as everyone knows, has been very deeply engaged in increasing the amount of its manufacturing and therefore exports from China. That's overall been a very positive trend, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But the result has been, as you can see both in the chart on the left and on the right, a remarkable, consistent increase in the size of the trade deficit. In other words, the scale of China's exports compared to the U.S. compared to the size of U.S. exports to China. So as of 2018, preliminary numbers would suggest that the deficit approached, again, almost 450 billion US dollars. That'll be a new record. You can see on the left, the line on the right is the U.S.-China trade deficit as a percentage of overall U.S. trade. The U.S. runs a trade deficit with the world, but whereas in 1998, China only represented a fraction of that total deficit, by now over half of the U.S. overall national trade deficit is with China. Now, hidden in those very large statistics of overall phenomenally strong and consistent growth in Chinese exports to the U.S., and as you'll see in terms of U.S. exports to China, you'll see in that chart on the top right, they more or less have been pegging along at about the same rate since about 2011. But while Chinese exports to the U.S. continue to grow year on year, and they did again in 2018, U.S. exports to China have been rather flat for the past few years, and the inevitable outcome of those two facts is a larger and larger trade deficit. A few areas of what we could consider to be relative good news is that the U.S. does very well consistently in what is called, at least in official economic language, trade in services. Well, what does that mean? It means we're selling things to each other that aren't physical goods, but are services. And in this case, counted up in that services numbers are things like Chinese tourists coming to the US and spending money shopping and touring, Chinese students in the US. So I think everyone in the room today will be aware that US has benefited tremendously from a very large influx year after year of capable Chinese students studying in great universities like the University of Michigan. As far as we can tell, the contribution of Chinese families' payments to US universities for tuition is creating about a $2 billion net benefit in trade terms to the US. So you could view it as actually, it's calculated, may seem a little bit counterintuitive, it's calculated as a US export. So every time a Chinese student comes to the US and begins paying tuition, either graduate or undergraduate, that counts, believe it or not, for economic statistical number keeping as a US export. So we're doing very well in that category, doing very well in terms of attracting Chinese tourists, and we're also doing very well in an industry that's overall quite important to US global competitiveness, which is the movie industry. So China is today the second largest movie market in the world. 15 years ago, it barely registered. Hollywood is doing quite well. Okay, we had a record year in 2018. Aquaman, which is, I guess, a movie some of you at least have seen, including me. That was the biggest grossing foreign movie of all time here in China. Came out last year. Now, so the US and Hollywood is overall doing really well in terms of getting movies into Chinese theaters and Chinese volunteering to buy tickets. And tickets here to go to the movies in China are generally a little even more expensive than they are in the US. So it's been a great area of success for the US economy overall, are what you would consider movie exports to China. But keep in mind, and this has become one of the underlying most sensitive and difficult to resolve issues in the overall US and China trade dispute, is China, for a variety of national reasons, national policy reasons, some having to do with social policies, some having to do with censorship, what the Chinese government considers appropriate content to be shown in China. As of now, the US movie industry is limited to be only being allowed to show between 35 and 40, to release 35 to 40 movies a year in China. That's compared to about 200 in the US, and Hollywood releases many of those 200 all around the world. So in every other major movie market, so France, Germany, Canada, Mexico, Japan, Korea, US movies come in and out of the country without any kind of government control, and that industry has become very large and important for the US globally, which are exports of filmed entertainment. But because of these restrictions in China, obviously, though overall Hollywood is earning far, far more now in China than it ever has, it still is probably just a fraction of what would be potentially their earnings in China if the movie market here were not so highly protectionist. So in addition to there being numerical quotas, as well as content censorship that limits the overall number of American movies allowed to be released and shown in Chinese theaters, Chinese government also restricts US movies to only being shown in what are considered the less popular and the less successful times of the year. So I think everybody in the room probably understands that if you want to make money with Hollywood movies, the best times during the US calendar to release a movie is generally over Memorial Day, Thanksgiving Day, and over the summer vacation, because there are just more people around to go to the movies. Kids are on vacation. So China has something very similar. The high season for Chinese going to the movies is during Chinese New Year, during school summer vacation, same as we have in the US, and then during a long, week-long Chinese holiday during the first week of October. All during those peak seasons of Chinese movie-going, no American movies are allowed to be shown in Chinese theaters, almost without exception. So though it's still a very, it's been an area of great success, one could clearly suggest that because of controls, Overall, Hollywood and therefore American earnings as an export to China have been very deeply constrained by Chinese government policy. Some of those policies are directly against the guidance and the rules that are imposed by what's called the World Trade Organization, which is the global group that tries to manage free trade globally. Another big successful U.S. export, which may come as a surprise to some of you, which is there on the right-hand scale, is the light blue line, which is called waste and scrap. Now, it may come as a surprise to you, but one of the great areas of U.S. export success to China has been exporting our garbage to China. For the last 15 years, it's been one of America's largest and fastest growing exports to China. Now, how could that be? I think all of us gathered here today who anticipate successful careers in business probably are not thinking that the generation and export of garbage would be a particularly interesting business opportunity. But for much of the last 15 years, it's been phenomenally successful here in China. Why? Because what we have is a kind of perfect symbiosis. We in America, we're very diligent about sorting our trash into different categories, as you know. And a lot of our paper, the paper garbage that we create, is actually very high quality by world standards, because most of the paper made and used in the U.S. is made from genuine wood pulp. So from, the pulp of what are called hardwoods. So it's very good quality. The Chinese didn't have access to such good paper. So what began to emerge, and now has grown very large until recently, was collecting up all of the sorted U.S. paper trash, putting it in all of the empty containers that arrive in the U.S. filled with Chinese exports that then enter into Walmart and every other retail channel and Amazon in the U.S. And the container ships were going back to China loaded, believe it or not, with U.S. trash. Now, this industry was, believe it or not, doing phenomenally well until about a year and a half ago, when the Chinese government, for environmental reasons, made a decision that it wanted to restrict this traffic. Why? Because they were importing what you should please understand to be just raw paper waste from the U.S., and then engaging in lots of very highly energy intensive and often quite polluting forms of recycling production here in China to turning it back into paper. And China has just decided that though it needs the paper, this way of producing it was leading towards unacceptably large levels of net pollution. So the result is, over the course of 2018, the Chinese government began to impose tighter and tighter controls on the import of American garbage. So believe it or not, and this is very illustrative of the source of many of the points and bones of contention between the U.S. and China, what the Chinese were doing for what appear to be fundamentally sound reasons, protecting their own environment, upgrading their own society, not having so many ships offloaded every day with just containers full of now aged U.S. rubbish, they decided to try to stop that trade and allow China to import more high-quality pulp for itself, but it has negative consequences on overall U.S. and China balance of trade, because that export of garbage by the U.S. has now been limited. So how is that trade now moving? More and more of our garbage is now being destined for recycling factories in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, where it's going to be turned into paper, into large rolls of industrial paper, and then the paper will be imported back into China. But from, I think you'll understand, an economic and export perspective, that U.S. garbage will no longer appear as an export to China. At the same time, some businessmen in the U.S. are also now considering how to get into this business of taking our sorted high-quality paper waste and turning it into quality paper pulp. And that should grow into an interesting business opportunity in the U.S. We've been involved a little bit as a company in a project like that. Challenge in the U.S., of course, is just getting the environmental permitting to do that kind of manufacturing in the U.S. Never easy. Now, a very important point that I believe has been lost in a lot of the contentious dialogue, especially that coming from the U.S. towards China, asking for changes in the structure of the Chinese economy. to suit the US. Most Americans today live much, much better than we did 40 years ago, thanks to China. Why is that? Because China has grown as a manufacturing and export center for so many of the products that we buy in the US. The overall impact of having China as a manufacturing base deeply integrated into the US economy was to keep prices low overall. Lower prices across the board for almost everything. The US consumer has benefited enormously from increasing US and Chinese trade and business relations. And what makes it particularly poignant is the biggest beneficiaries relatively of the positive effect of having more what are we considered fairly priced, lower priced products imported from China. The biggest beneficiaries are people in the US on limited salaries. You could call them our poor people. They've benefited as a percent much, much more from the fact that overall prices in the store have been held down, as you'll see in that chart, and in many cases have actually fallen over the last 20 years, almost entirely due to the positive effect of being able to import more and more high quality but fairly priced products from China. Okay, so you'll see, other than the products on the chart on the left that come directly imported from China, other items that don't have any access to what we would call Chinese manufacturing, so that includes things like haircuts and airline tickets, all things where China doesn't really have any direct role in our economy. Those prices have increased rather steadily. That's that line on the top right of the chart on the top left. Whereas all the prices of products that we're now importing from China have really held steady in some cases, and in the cases you'll see in mobile phones, relatively have fallen rather dramatically. What does that mean? Well, as the chart in the middle shows, it means, as I say, everyone is able to spend much more. We say consume much more, because prices overall of everything have been held to lower levels because of the deep economic integration between China and the US. It's a great story that sadly too often gets told to Americans themselves, how much their own individual lifestyles have benefited from deep integrated free trade between China and the US. But of course there are trade-offs. The biggest one, and the one you have heard about, has been the overall impact of the US shifting more and more of its manufacturing to factories here in China, has been the overall impact on what's called manufacturing employment in China. Now, this has been a long-term trend in the US, even since before China became a major trading partner of the US. The US was, as Europe has, Japan has been on its own for very good reasons. What we say, it's been deindustrializing. Simply put, we've been moving from a manufacturing to a knowledge-based economy. So that trend was very clear, unstoppable, and underway for many decades, but it's been accelerated now because of the deep integration of the US and the Chinese economy, because it's meant that manufacturing just about everything became much more economically efficient, doing it in China and then exporting it on container ships back to the US. So as China rose up as the workshop of the world, the only real victim of this overall positive trend were workers who were working in manufacturing jobs in the US. What no one could have foreseen, at least in theory, economic theory, everyone could see that the US would be shifting away from manufacturing, and we would all want, in a perfect world, for those workers to, let's say, down their tools on an assembly line and then immediately shift to becoming a computer programmer. But of course, in the real world that we all live in, and particularly in states like where all of you live, like Michigan, that's turned out to be a much harder transition for many Americans to make. They've lost their jobs in manufacturing, but haven't been able to reskill themselves and learn what they needed to find a place and a well-paying job in what we now consider, as I said, the knowledge economy. So instead of being praised for helping Americans live better overall, which is clearly true, China has become more and more the target of criticism that it's causing unemployment and despair in manufacturing towns across the country in the US. But now let's look at what the overall impact on China has been of its own economic growth and its deep economic integration with the US. What you see here are obviously 6 different measures of how China has changed over this same period of time, excuse me, that we've been talking about. So the US across the spectrum has been growing more and more unhappy about the result of China's economic rise. But within China, make no mistake, the country as a whole has reaped enormous benefits. In every measurable area, China, both individually and as a society, has made enormous gains. So while the US has been trying to cope with China's success, China, of course, has no such problem. These have been remarkable, almost miraculous 40 years for everyone here in China. From a country where once clothing and food were rationed, which is the China that I first entered in 1981, China has now evolved into a consumer paradise by just about anyone's standards. You look at the chart in the middle on the lower row, which is to show auto production. China, as recently as 20 years ago, basically had no private ownership of cars and very few factories producing cars anywhere in China. But as everywhere we've seen in the world, and as Chinese have learned, certainly particularly increasingly over the last 10 years, owning a car brings with it enormous enjoyment as well as a greater sense of personal freedom. So the Chinese now are living in the world's largest, by far, manufacturer and market for automobiles. You can see now we produced last year in China about 30 million vehicles. That's about twice the number in the US. There are obviously pollution trade-offs here, which we can talk about later if you're interested. But the overall impact of China going from a country with almost no private car ownership to being the largest car market in the world has been, on an individual level, I would suggest, overwhelmingly positive, for the same reason that most of us all enjoy owning and driving a car. So China produced about 30 million vehicles last year, and it still has hopes that that will increase by still about another 15% to producing 35 million vehicles a year by 2025. That'll be at least 3 times larger than the size of the auto industry in the US. But it's important, and the way this is also understood by policymakers in the US, gains in the automobile manufacturing and automobile sales market in China have also been propped up by very generous Chinese government subsidies, which is less well known. Government financial aid for China's car industry has grown by about 50% a year between 2010 and 2015. And many of China's own domestic large car companies, because here we have a mix of both all the international brands that you all are familiar with, Mercedes, Toyota, Honda, BMW, Ford, GM, Hyundai, they all manufacture here in China. They're about half the Chinese market. The other half are Chinese brands, which so far very few of you have heard of, but are quite common on the roads here. Those Chinese brands, Chinese automakers, benefit from very generous Chinese government subsidies. Chinese government has prioritized the growth of its automobile industry, both as a source of employment, of economic growth, as improved living standards. But as a way to just continue for that industry, to support that industry's growth, China engages in direct subsidies to its automobile industry of rather significant size, not just the gas consuming, but increasingly very large subsidies, as you may be aware, for electric vehicles, which China now has quite a lot on the road. Finally, the last chart on the lower right just shows that China, from 40 years ago being a country that was barely 20% people living in cities, it was 80% what we would call farmers, peasants. It's now, as you can see, it's about 55% urban, and what you're seeing on that chart on the lower right are all of China's very large cities, and what that looks like is exactly the China I live in. It's almost a complete urban landscape now along the eastern half of China, which is also where I live. So these last 40 years in the aggregate, again, enormously successful. That's what these charts show, is Chinese doing better, living better year after year. Now, what we're now coming into in today's discussion is a little bit more of the bones of main contention between the U.S. and China. An important one, and we talked about it, which is the role of the government in an economy. We in the U.S. have always been, we have been promoting both internally as well as globally that the government should keep its hands off the economy as much as possible and not engage in too much centralized planning as well as subsidies. But China takes a very different economic road, and that's most clearly become apparent in what many of you have probably heard of, which is China's what's called the Made in China 2025 plan. It was approved 4 years ago by the Chinese government, and while China is used to having a set of 5-year plans that outline what the government's lofty economic goals will be, this Made in China 2025 has gained a lot of attention controversially outside of China itself, because what China has done in this particular, beginning 4 or 5 years ago, is China set explicit targets for itself to increase the share of made in China products in most major fields of advanced manufacturing and technology. So the risk, as it's understood in the US and European and other developed countries, is if China does achieve the goals on the lower left, which are how much of the market within China for all these advanced, high quality, high margin products will be made within China itself, the likely result will be companies making those products from outside China are going to find it increasingly hard to compete inside China. So that is overall, when seen from countries other than China, to be a very negative direction that the Chinese economy is taking. But for China, it's of course extremely important, the Made in China 2025. So while the US's government is requesting that China soften these targets, if not eliminate them altogether, that's a very difficult trade-off for China to accept. Because what China is really outlining here, though it's called Made in China 2025, is really part of an overall process to upgrade the overall structure of China's economy from what's been overall a very low to middle margin and value economy to one where China will more and more make the highest profit, highest margin products that we're all very familiar with. They're largely technology products, things like semiconductors and robots and advanced aviation, advanced aircraft and the avionics. China has very ambitious and transparent plans to make those products for itself, by itself, and make the market within China much more dominated by Chinese domestic manufacturers. So this is a challenge not only as far as the U.S. is concerned, but if you look on the lower right, what this is attempting to summarize visually is you'll see the names of most of the world's developed countries. They all engage in some degree of advanced manufacturing exports to China. And what this chart is summarizing on the lower right is really that if in 6 years, by 2025, China realizes these goals, all of the world's major developed economies will feel the impact because the market within China will be increasingly closed to their exports. So this is an important issue that has shown itself up till now to be very difficult to resolve. For the U.S., what it appears to be is a plan by China to make its market even less friendly to high-value U.S. technology investments and aircraft. Aircraft is generally, year after year, the U.S.'s single biggest export to China. That's Boeing. China, as you probably know, you can see it there on the lower left. China is beginning now to try, and within the next 2 years, they will start to take to the air, first flown by Chinese domestic airlines. It's beginning to make its own airlines. So that's not been a plan that we could understand that Boeing and Airbus would be terribly much in favor of. So China has looked at everything they're importing, studied where it appears these products both have very high growth potential as well as very high levels of profitability. And please make no mistake, China has ambitions to create companies and structures and a domestic base where it can become increasingly self-reliant in all those products. But as I'm suggesting to you, that goal, which on most levels should be understood to be highly positive, as well as echoing the pathway that US, Europe, and Japan all have taken over the last 50 years. In the case of China, the way it's being understood is as potentially a world-altering threat to global economic balance. Another great ambition of China is to compete more directly in high technology, and specifically, Chinese talk a lot about competing directly with Silicon Valley. What you're looking here is China's technology sector as a percentage of the US. You'll see in many areas the US remains significantly ahead of China. China still has some huge weaknesses in its domestic technology industry. Technology firms here are only worth about a third as much as high-tech companies in America, based on the aggregate size of their role in the economy. Their R&D budgets are much, much smaller, and the outcome from that R&D is much less productive than it is in high-tech in the US. And they also, Chinese technology companies, some of which you've heard of, like Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent, generate very little relative of their revenue outside of China. And in another very important sector we'll talk more about, in semiconductors, China still has a very, very small domestic industry. But to give a sense about just how reliant China's technology industry is on the China market, which I think, as you'll know, for some major leading US technology companies like Google and Facebook, they are not in China. They are either explicitly or implicitly not allowed to operate here. So it's made this a very lucrative market for China's own technology companies. But the result is those Chinese technology companies are less well known outside of China, but have grown very large inside of China. As just a point of reference, Apple makes every 3 days selling Apple products outside the US. Every 3 days, it makes more than Tencent, China's biggest or second biggest, depending on the day, technology company, than Tencent makes selling its products and services outside China in a year. But nonetheless, so the US still remains far ahead in very many crucial metrics. China is now approaching parity on some very forward-looking measures. E-commerce in China is now more than double the size that it is in the US. Mobile payments, I think, as you know, which is we in China now live fundamentally in a cash-free economy. Everyone pays for even the smallest purchases here by swiping their mobile phone. That industry is far, far larger, as you see on the far right in China, than it is in the US. The number of what we call unicorns, the companies with a valuation either on the stock market or in venture capital funding of over $1 billion. Number of unicorns between China and the US is about equal. And what you'll see on the lower part of this chart is that whereas in 2013, the list of the 20 largest internet companies was pretty evenly spread. It was still clearly dominated by the US, but there were contributions from Japan, from Russia, from Korea, and even some a little further down the list from Europe. As of today, the 20 largest internet companies are all either Chinese or the US. So Silicon Valley and China were until recently not only competing, but also growing closer due to heavy Chinese investment in Silicon Valley, as venture capital funds from within China were seeking to invest early in and therefore participate in high technology growth opportunities in the US, as well as, of course, learn more about those industries and the technology. Now under increasingly intensive US scrutiny, that VC investment by Chinese VC firms in Silicon Valley has slowed to a trickle. And many technology companies now in Silicon Valley are becoming much less interested to accept Chinese outside investment. So whereas before Silicon Valley and China were acting as what we would call frenemies, they were both competing as well as collaborating very actively. Today there's much less active collaboration and much more direct competition. Another very important controversial constituent of China's national policy is something I think most of you have heard of. It's called the Belt and Road initiative. This is China's own attempt, under pressure from the US and Europe, to develop an economic zone, an economic backyard of its own, not part of any of the major alliances in the Western world. And that policy has become generally incorporated within the term of the Belt and Road Initiative. You can see it visually displayed in front of you. It's a connection of to build and invest in infrastructure to help nations to China's west, including Central Asia, South Asia, Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Eastern Africa. China is investing in all those areas to help those countries develop their own infrastructure. It really is the signature foreign policy initiative of the current Chinese government. But lately, it's also begun to run into unexpected criticism. The U.S. began to speak ever more loudly as a government about what it called China's debtor diplomacy, that China wasn't, as the U.S. did in the 1940s, giving money by virtue of a Marshall Plan. It was making loans to these countries, and often at what were considered to be rather exorbitant interest rates. So the result has been not only because of U.S. pressure, but pressure within some of the recipient countries of China's Belt and Road Initiative, particularly Malaysia and Pakistan. Over the last year, those were up until recently the two friendliest countries to China and the Belt and Road Initiative. Over the course of 2018, they elected, rather surprisingly, both elected new governments that have indicated, particularly strongly in the case of Malaysia, that they want to back away from many of China's planned Belt and Road investments. They're concerned about the level of debt that they would be taking on to build and to have Chinese build in their countries these vast new infrastructure programs. So at the same time, too, the Belt and Road Initiative has recently come under some criticism within China, because there's also concern here that many of these loans that were made to finance the Belt and Road Initiative would not be economically sound. So China at the moment, as they now confront a very treacherous economic pathway in its relationship with the U.S., is also dealing now with a separate issue that they really hadn't anticipated, that the Belt and Road Initiative, at least for now, isn't moving forward with the speed or with the success that was originally planned. I'm sharing with you just very quickly here this headline because it reflects something that's also very important about where the U.S. has grown as far as China is concerned. This is an editorial from the New York Times. As you see, it was just a couple days ago, 4 days ago. And, if you're interested, you can read the editorial. What it really summarizes is a fact that maybe, again, is a little bit less known, that what this particular writer is referencing is the fact that really pretty much now across the political divide in the U.S., that we know a lot about how polarized our politics is in the U.S., about the only issue that the Democrats and the Republicans now agree on is the need to aggressively confront China. So while President Trump has become clearly the face of this initiative, particularly as far as the Chinese are concerned, it's important to recognize that whereas for most of China's remarkable 40-year economic ascent, China enjoyed a lot of political support and support from the business community in the U.S., a lot of that over the course of the last couple of years has all but disappeared. And this is unprecedented. The people who were always very active advocating closer ties between the U.S. and China, to have more business, more trade, have all but gone silent. The business lobby in the U.S., which until recently was able to persuade the U.S. government not to push back hard on China to get them to change policies or open markets more, have lately become much less visible. And the simple way to understand that is this process through which the overall political climate in the U.S. has turned increasingly confrontational to China is simply the result of China's success. It's a much richer, much more powerful, much more assertive country than it ever has. And as it's grown more assertive, it's of course found that very often its policy priorities run into conflict with the U.S. So where we are today is, as I said, within the next 2 weeks, we have moved from what's been steady bickering between the two largest economies over the last 5 years into something like a full-blown trade war. You can see the U.S. has changed the terms of the debate as far as China is concerned. Whereas before it was mainly a question about how big the bilateral trade deficit is, the U.S. is now emphasizing that China needs to do something about what the U.S. believes to be rampant IP theft, piracy, and counterfeiting, that there are enormous structural issues in China's economy, not just a trade deficit, that the U.S. now demands that China resolve. And the reason that we're now at this state of brinksmanship with fewer than 2 weeks to go before what the U.S. has announced would be the imposition of quite punitive 25% tariffs on most Chinese exports to the U.S., the reason we've reached this is the U.S. is now asking not just for what you could see to be short-term and somewhat cosmetic changes by having China buy more U.S. products to lower the deficit, but it's really asking China to change the overall structure of its economy. One important way to understand this is China, for its own domestic economic reasons, has over the course of the last 20 to 30 years increasingly closed off some very important industries within China to U.S. and foreign investment. So as of today, while the U.S. economy, at least from a regulatory perspective, remains completely open to Chinese investment in just about every industry except those directly impacting national security, China, in order to create within China successful companies in these industries, has made some of the most important industries, particularly important to the U.S., because as you'll see, these are all industries where the U.S. enjoys quite significant competitive advantage. The Chinese market is all but closed to U.S. majority control investments in China in financial services, healthcare, internet, most high technology, cloud services, logistics, education, aviation. All of these very large, important, fast-growing, high-margin industries have significant blocks in China against U.S. and all foreign investment activity. And the U.S. would like to see those blocks removed. But those are industries, of course, that China views as a key to its future, and so that they need protection, and that's not a policy that is unfamiliar. Japan and Korea did something similar. The U.S. is now saying you've reached a state of development where you need to open up those sectors, so U.S. can effectively export more by being able to participate in more of China's economy. Up till now, that's been a demand that the Chinese have been unwilling to fully accept. So while the U.S. sees the fundamental roots of the issue between itself and China in trade and business terms as being one about fairness and reciprocity, Chinese almost universally believe what's really going on is the U.S. is trying to hinder China, to tie it down, and to block its further rise. So the way that the Chinese media tries to explain the current tension between the U.S. and China is through statements like this, which comes from China's Communist Party main newspaper, the People's Daily. What it broadcasts to people here is the following: anyone who tries to hinder China's emergence is like a mantis trying to stop a car or an ant trying to shake a tree, and will pay a bitter price in the end. In other words, China is saying what the U.S. is really asking of it is to stop its economic growth dead in its tracks, and that's just simply unacceptable. So what's the result now, even as we face a prolonged period of increased U.S. and Chinese tension, with the potential for much larger and more economically damaging tariffs, first to be introduced by the U.S., but then almost certainly to be replied with equally severe tariffs that the Chinese will put on U.S. exports to China? The result is, whatever happens with these trade talks, whether we have a settlement, a stalemate, or even, God forbid, an all-out trade war, something permanent and important for business and investment is taking place. Largely unknown, but it's of the greatest significance, is that the world supply chains are being now deeply uprooted and rerouted. for the reasons I touched on about the benefits for U.S. consumers over the last 40 years from having very large and increasing exports of quality Chinese products into the U.S. market. Those are all thanks to very deep trade ties and supply chain ties between the U.S. and China. That supply chain is now being rerouted outside of China to other parts of the world. You can see that both in the chart on the left and on the right. The primary beneficiaries of the last year of increasing trade tension between China, business and investment tension in China and the U.S., the primary beneficiaries up till today are Vietnam and then also India. India, I think over the last year, has made some remarkable changes of its own. Foxconn, which manufactures Apple phones, as you all know, made its first significant investment to begin manufacturing those phones in India. At first, they've announced those phones will be for Indian consumers only, but it now looks almost unavoidable that increasingly products that we've all grown familiar with shopping for and buying with made in China will become steadily less visible in U.S. stores because American businesses are beginning to move their manufacturing and their sources of imports to the U.S. to other parts of the world. So this is an enormous and ongoing change to the U.S. Structure of the U.S. economy. And while it's creating significant disruptions in China, because the overall outcome of this will be to impact China's the size of and employment levels in China's manufacturing, it's clearly benefiting Southeast Asia, benefiting India. U.S. has seen a little bit of benefit, though not so much. Mexico is seeing some benefit. The real thing is that it's also creating a whole new set of economic opportunities. So whereas the U.S. were in the forefront of investing in China's rise to become such a major, deeply integrated part of the U.S. economy, what we're now seeing is those same businesses seeking to diversify away from China. So where does it look like we're headed early now in 2019? Whatever the outcome, I think it would be true to say that the economic pain for both societies sadly looks like it's likely to become more rather than less acute. The table on the left shows U.S. listed, well-known U.S. companies by the percentage of their revenues that are now come from the China market. All these companies, and there are some household names on that list. I think if you can see them, you'll see Texas Instruments, Qualcomm, Intel, Western Digital. These are some of America's leading technology companies, now derive a significant share of their revenues and therefore profits from the China market. That will be deeply impacted by this next round, should it come to pass, of reciprocal, much stronger and higher tariffs. These companies are all in the firing line, and they've seen their share prices deeply hit over the last year as investors began to contemplate what it might mean as they were not able to export as freely and successfully to China as they have been up till now. They've been able, these companies, keep in mind, to export successfully to China, but many of them have found it much more difficult to establish wholly owned manufacturing in China. In fact, in most cases, they've been prohibited to fully own their own manufacturing locations in China. So they've chosen instead to export. Now, the challenge from relying on exports to China is that when tariffs are attached to those exports, those products become economically prohibitive. For China, the pain is more distinct and more widespread. It means, as I said, changes in manufacturing employment, likely higher prices for consumers, as it may mean for the U.S. And in one particular industry, it will create an even larger challenge for China, and that's the industry that we spend a lot of time as a company working in and investing in, which is the semiconductor industry. So China, it's not widely known. Everyone saw earlier today that China now has a very large number of cars on the road. It has a very large number of automobiles. But believe it or not, it is the world's largest petroleum importer. But there's one category of imports even larger than petroleum to power their cars and power their buses and planes, and that's semiconductors. Semiconductors are now the largest import to China every year. And you can see the scale when seen on the right of China's trade deficit in semiconductors, that China is overwhelmingly reliant, as of today, on imported semiconductors. And there are two dangers with that. China has tried very aggressively through investing literally over $100 billion to try to create a domestic semiconductor industry to compete with the best of the US and Europe on its own, and has so far not achieved very much success, which is why those light blue bars on the right side of the chart are still at such low ebb, because China's semiconductor industry is still relatively backward. And the risk for China as this trade war, God forbid, if it does continue to unfold, what that will mean is China is much more vulnerable to having restrictions placed on its imports of semiconductors. And it needs semiconductors for just about everything it relies on to manufacture, both for its own customers and for exports. So China has an enormous need to increase the scale and the success of its domestic semiconductor industry, and has had very large plans to do so. The challenge that it's faced is that this trade tension with the US, if you like, has come about a little too early. It's occurring before China has really been able to bring its semiconductor industry up to a state of global competitiveness. And China became acutely aware of how vulnerable it is to any kind of severe tension and pressure from the US in terms of semiconductors less than a year ago. I think many of you will have read in April last year, the US introduced penalties and sanctions against a very large Shenzhen-based technology company called ZTE. It was accused of having broken US and United Nations sanctions by trading with Iran and North Korea. The US chose to punish ZTE by saying, ZTE, you can do whatever you were doing up till today, but as of today, you can't buy anything from America. Carry on making whatever you're making, but you can't use anything imported from the US, was the US penalty imposed last April. Almost immediately when the penalty was announced, it was understood by ZTE and then the Chinese government that not being able to import US semiconductors, US technology, was the equivalent of a death sentence for ZTE. And ZTE is one of the largest technology companies in China. As the chairman of ZTE itself said at the time, had the US sanctions not in the end been reversed and ZTE been allowed again to buy US chips and other high technology components, ZTE would have itself been comatose. So I think, as you've probably also been reading, ZTE's larger competitor, which is also a Shenzhen company called Huawei, is now become even more of a direct and explicit target for many of the same reasons that ZTE was targeted last year, which is for sanctions busting. Now, we're still in a very early shadow boxing stage. Huawei is infinitely more important to China and to us here in Shenzhen, or the economy here, than was ZTE. Should the US decide to go down a similar route as it first implemented and then reversed with ZTE, which would be to say to Huawei, as punishment for your sanctions busting, we are going to prohibit you at this stage from freely buying US technology, the result for Huawei would probably be catastrophic. So China and Huawei itself has been trying very hard to wean itself off US technology, but up till now has been unsuccessful doing so. So what you see here in my final slide for now is that obviously Donald Trump is leading what we now call a decoupling of the two economies, where this will clearly lead to major economic realignment, as well as economic opportunities in new markets, as well as opportunities to continue to invest in, as we do successfully, in areas of China's domestic economic growth. If you bear with me for a second, I'm gonna quickly pull up. We don't have a lot of time left. I want to pull up, if I can, your questions, which I enjoyed receiving very much. So if I can, I was going to run through them because I really do appreciate Are we back? Hello? Are we back, David?
Yes, yes.
Great.
You're back.
Apologies
Living
for
color.
that. Apologies. I'm going to try and call up your questions if you allow me just to monkey for a second with Blue Jeans. I think I should be able to do it. So just very quickly, I hope you're now seeing on screen
Yep.
all of your questions. Again, I think you'll see them there. So very quickly, just let me march through these because again, I'm very pleased and honored you guys took the time to conceive of these questions. As an American, how have you positioned yourself to gain trust with investors? Been here for a long time, and trust is very important in China, maybe than in other countries. So we are in a very fortunate position now, having done this for over 10 years, that we do have quite deep and trusted relationships, with particularly with Chinese corporate and even with Chinese government entities. They're seeing that our fundamental activity are to try to invest in and assist in the improvement and upgrading of China's own technology industry as well as consumer economy. In terms of what we do, someone has asked how many different transactions we did last year. We were particularly busy last year with doing the kind of principal investing I talked about, this merchant banking. Last year was a very busy year. We did about, I think we did 5 projects, which are, again, a kind of mix of identifying business areas, creating investment structures and companies to target them. And they were almost evenly divided between projects in China's consumer economy, as well as in China's semiconductor and high technology industry. Our unique value proposition, I think, is largely that we are very engaged in the process with our partners and investors of determining very actively where we see ripe, mature, and attractive high margin investment opportunities. Next set of questions. Chinese market is often difficult to penetrate because of legal protections. This remains one of the challenges for all investors in China, as well as all corporates operating here. China is not isn't as reliable in terms of the predictability and certainty of regulatory enforcement and legal enforcement as in other markets. And that's remained a consistent challenge for business here. There's signs of improvement. In other words, as China has been maturing, but it is true that the Chinese government is a very active player in the Chinese economy up and down the line. And to be successful here, you need to be sure that what you're doing here is consistent with China's explicit government policy, that it should be making positive contributions to China's development as well as overall GDP growth. So if you're not doing that, if you're on the fringes or in the gray area somewhere, for example, I just was visited by a very successful private equity investor from the U.S. who's been a long-term business partner of mine. For whatever reason, his particular area, and you've been reading that, of most active investment over the last 3 years has been in the now booming in the U.S. cannabis industry. I'm sure you've all been reading about. Now, he's been doing very well. You've read that companies in the legalized cannabis business have been going public in the U.S. He's done, as I say, one of the leading investors in that sector. He was coming to China with the idea that China might be ripe for something very similar, since other parts of the world seemed as if they were moving along a spectrum of being able to legalize cannabis and making products seen as being good for health as well as being good for things like additives and cosmetics. The challenge that he faces, which gets to question number 1 here, is doing things involving cannabis. That's a gray area in China. And it's generally not recommended that any foreign investor in any country, and especially in China, do things that are in legal gray area. So he did spend a little bit of time with me, but overall about 10 days here in China running around, seeing if there was a cannabis industry that could be nurtured here in China and built up into some scale. And though I kind of warned him as a friend before he got here, I thought a lot of his time here would be spent with very little to show for it. That is indeed what's come about. So important, again, to be operating within the broad current of where China wants its society to go. And those are very explicit goals and directions, so not a lot of guesswork needed. People will know from my talk last year where we talked about question number 2, a zombie kingdom in China PE and VC industry. What I mean by that, just very quickly, is China's had enormous growth in its venture capital and private equity industry. It's now about the same size as the U.S., but at least in cash distributions to investors, what we call DPI, which is the only standard in the end that really matters in private equity and venture capital, which is not how much money do you make on paper, but how much money do you make in cash and distribute out to your LPs, to your investors. China's PE and VC industry has historically, over the last 5 and 10 years, had the lowest rates of cash returns to investors of any PE market in history. And the main reason for that is Chinese government controls the number of companies that can have IPOs here every year, as well as which companies get chosen. It's not the market, it's the Chinese government. The zombie kingdom refers to something now approaching 10,000 PE and VC invested companies in China that were invested in the hopes of being one of those that would be chosen for IPO, or in the hopes that China would liberalize and open up its IPO market. That still hasn't happened. So what we have are many, many thousands of Chinese companies that have PE and VC money trapped in them. The companies can't IPO. The PE investors can't get their money out. And again, it's just an inevitable outcome of the fact China, unlike other markets, the government decides on the number and the pacing and the actual companies that will be allowed to have IPOs. And that number of IPOs has always been strictly limited in China, because China does not want too many new companies to IPO for fear that too much new supply of shares will bring down the overall share market. That may or may not be economically and financially true, but it's the way that Chinese regulators operate, to put very severe caps on the number of IPOs every year. When we talk about has China leapfrogged the U.S. in AI startups, I have a chart which I won't bother to call up because that's a little challenging, but what you've been reading about that I think is a little bit overblown. I have a chart that, again, I'll make sure David has if anyone wants to see it. In fact, Chinese investment in AI over the last year has taken a very steep downturn compared to what you've been reading. The reason is there was a lot of hot money went into Chinese AI investment, artificial intelligence, and over the last 3 years, very little to show for it. While overall investment in US AI is not only numerically larger than in China, but continues to grow on year. And the reason seems to be quite simply that, by and large, the US is creating many more valuable and sustainable AI companies in China. So having the will to create an AI industry is certainly where China leads the world, and it's important. But of course, it doesn't guarantee outcomes. It doesn't guarantee you will create world-leading companies. And so far, with only a few exceptions, China really isn't producing world-leading companies in AI. The US remains quite far ahead. And if anyone is very interested in AI and how it actually works outside the headline, I would urge everybody to do a little bit of homework on something called TensorFlow TPU. It's an initiative, a business built within Google, where Google is now not just running a search engine, but manufacturing its own semiconductors. It's a very new initiative for Google, and it is making the world's most advanced semiconductors specifically for use in artificial intelligence. Why is Google able to do so well in doing things like games of winning at chess and Go? Because it has fundamental world dominance in the underlying hardware, chips required to do that very advanced AI. And in that area, China is still very far behind the US, and the US is accelerating its gains. What are the inefficiencies in Chinese public markets that create opportunities for PE investments? Lots of inefficiencies, mainly that the banking sector, the other source of capital for companies, right? Because you have both debt and equity. Most debt financing in China, bank lending in China, is overwhelmingly skewed towards lending towards Chinese state-owned companies, while the companies that most need new capital, and in fact can put it to best use, at least up till now statistically, by investing successfully and growing and building profits, are China's private sector companies. China's banks are state-owned. China's lending industry is state-owned. And so both sides of the loan industry in China, both the banks and the recipients of lending, are overwhelmingly all state-owned. So the private sector really only has the choice of raising the growth capital it needs by raising equity. That's why this has been such an interesting and fast-growing market for PE and VC. The need is so large, and debt finance plays, whereas in the US it plays the majority role of financing corporate growth. In China, in the private sector economy, it's almost non-existent. What's your general advice to foreign investors looking for acquisitions? Very difficult. Someone references a transaction that General Mills, state next door to you, Minnesota, they've had probably the most successful acquisition of a Chinese company, which is China's leading dumpling brand called Wanzai-Mato, is owned actually by Americans, hugely successful company, but it really is an outlier as a success in M&A. And the reason is, and Wanzai-Mato, when General Mills bought it, importantly, wasn't a Chinese company, it was a Hong Kong company. Up till now, few, if any, success stories of foreign investors acquiring purely Chinese companies and managing them successfully. One thing, it's very difficult to manage a Chinese company that's been founder, started, and led. Another thing is most Chinese, well, you could say Chinese listed companies are off limits to acquisition. So remember, most M&A in the US is still, by dollar value, listed companies taking over other listed companies. That does not occur in China. There's been almost no regulatory approval for listed companies being bought by either private equity firms, which has not happened, or being bought by other listed companies. Chinese securities regulator, the Chinese SEC, frowns on that kind of activity. Limited in, exit opportunities, expected returns have been, as I say, that goes back to zombie kingdom, is expected returns have always been high, delivered returns have been very low. So we're beginning to see a peaking of both PE and VC investing in China. So it's grown very large, but we're not seeing anything like the growth that we've seen previously, because it's just proved very hard to get money out from investment deals in China. It's easy to get money in, much harder to get out. As someone here references, China moved from capital starved to capital excess. It's not so much a structural imbalance. It's really just, as I said, China has an enormous need for capital, and the banking sector is almost exclusively reserved for state-owned companies. The next question I touched on, which is about China's demographic challenge. Next question is about the prominent PE firms, Blackstone, Carlyle, Goldman, Bain, TPG. They were once the leaders in China's private equity industry in China, and they've now been wildly overtaken largely by China-specific private equity firms. A lot of reasons for that. One of the key ones is the big global private equity companies, by and large, have been trying to invest dollars because they raise dollars from their LPs, not renminbi. And it was always legally complicated and sometimes difficult or impossible to get regulatory approval for them to transfer their dollars into renminbi to invest in a Chinese company. So what's happened in parallel, and far more successfully, is Chinese PE and VC firms got started where their capital is in renminbi. And finally, marching through here very quickly, Chinese companies investing abroad, it's a great question. But as of about a year and a half ago, the Chinese government more or less shut down all Chinese investment in the main, corporate investment outside of China. It went from enormous scale of over $100 billion a year into the US to last year being not zero, but fractional. And that's been true globally. China did this for two primary reasons. It didn't like the drain on its foreign exchange reserves as Chinese companies took their renminbi, transferred them into US dollars to buy assets outside of China. China's foreign exchange reserves fell. The other more deep and underlying reason was the Chinese regulators were seeing that Chinese cross-border investing, M&A and portfolio investing, real estate investing, was on the aggregate not at all very successful. And they began to think both they didn't want to incur the drain on their national foreign exchange reserves, and they didn't want to encourage Chinese to make what was decided at a regulatory basis to be just a lot of very unsuccessful bad investments. So that trend, which was once very pronounced of high degrees of Chinese cross-border and offshore investment, has all but been eliminated as a primary source of M&A and investment capital flows over the last year and a half. Will that change? Will there be a liberalization of those controls? I think I was asked that a year ago, and I said I didn't foresee it in the following year. Well, I think that was true a year ago. I would stick with my judgment from 2018, from January 2000. I don't foresee that changing. So China will be much less important players in buying and bidding for prominent assets of global companies, both in US and in Europe. China's construction companies, as